In the 16th century, a man with a gold-hooped earring and a little goatee picked up a quill and wrote some of the finest sonnets the world has ever seen. 500 years later, a man with nothing better to do sits down with a microphone and tries to work out what the hell that bloke was going on about. Welcome to the final couplet. Hello and welcome back to the final couplet with me, Theo Cowan. Happy New Year, I guess, is in order. It's been 450 odd years since Shakespeare sat down at his little writing desk and got out his quill and started writing these sonnets. And that's quite a long time, isn't it? But what we've discovered is a lot of his stuff is still relevant today and still resonates, doesn't it? I mean, we've got, toxic relationships, relationships with big age gaps, Shakespeare thinking he's inferior creatively. I mean, imagine Shakespeare thinking he's not good enough. If he thinks it, then really the rest of us can think it, can't we? Because he's sort of known as one of the greatest writers to ever live. So if he's thinking, oh, no, I'm not very good at writing today, then, that gives the rest of us a little free pass, doesn't it? And I think it's nice to think, at this time, all those years ago, Shakespeare was sat at his kitchen table thinking about what his New Year's resolutions were going to be. Maybe it was as simple as get outside more, go on some runs, join the gym, drink less mead. I don't know, it's all conjecture, but I think those are all pretty reasonable things for him to think about as New Year's resolutions. Not too dissimilar from our own today. Anyway, today we're looking at Sonnet 38, because that is the sonnet that comes after 37, if you believe it. And in Sonnet 37, we sort of discovered that Shakespeare maybe has quite a big age gap between him and the recipient of the poems, his lover, because he's sort of describing himself as a proud father figure. And then, of course, he went on to say how much he loves the recipient of the poems, of course, as he does in most of the sonnets, and how inferior he is to the recipient of the poem. So let's see what Sonnet 38 has to bring for us today. Sonnet 38. How can my muse want subject to invent, while thou dost breathe? Thou pour'st into my verse thine own sweet argument, too excellent for every vulgar paper to rehearse. O give thyself the thanks, if aught in me worthy perusal stand against thy sight. For who's so dumb that cannot write to thee, when thou thyself dost give invention light? Be thou the 10th muse, 10 times more in worth than those old 9 which rhymers invocate. And he that calls on thee, let him bring forth eternal numbers to outlive long date. If my slight muse do please these curious days, the pain be mine, but thine shall be the praise. Oh, I've missed these sonnets where Shakespeare says that he's not a great writer, and actually how writing is bloody easy if you've got a great subject to write about, which I'm sure a lot of writers say to this day. I mean, I've definitely heard some pretty famous screenwriters say that, the story, it writes itself, really. And that's what Shakespeare's saying here, essentially, is that, I'm not a great writer. It's just the subject is just so easy to write about. If you can't write about that subject, then you must be bloody awful. He's done a few sonnets like this in the past, where it's the classic faux humble Shakespeare, where he's like, oh, look, I'm not that great, all right? I've just got great material to work with. Which I like. It's funny. It's funny to see Shakespeare do that. And it's quite obvious, isn't it? I wonder if back then the people that were reading his sonnets thought, oh God, not one of these again. That's so annoying when he's doing his sort of faux humble thing. Wonder if Ben Jonson was sat down on his couch reading that and going, oh, bloody Shakespeare. Oh, I'm not good at writing. I just have good material. Sick of it. That's how I like to think it was received. Anyway, before I slag Shakespeare off any further, I think we should dive into Sonnet 38 and work out what the hell Shakespeare was going on about. So he starts with, how can my muse want subject to invent while thou dost breathe? Which basically means, yeah, how can I lack things to write about while you're knocking about? As long as you're alive, I will be able to write. So that's a good thing. Thou pour'st into my verse thine own sweet argument, too excellent for every vulgar paper to rehearse. Which I think means you give me amazing inspiration for my writing by giving me the best subject of all, yourself. It's far too excellent and brilliant a subject for crappy, ordinary writers to describe. So I guess here he is bigging himself up a little bit. He's saying, I'm not an ordinary writer. Like, ordinary writers, they can't describe you. You've got to be a pretty good writer. So maybe I was wrong in my faux humble thing here, because he's not really being faux humble at all. He's not being humble. He's actually being, dare I say, arrogant. But don't worry, there's faux humble stuff to come. Oh, give thyself the thanks, if aught in me worthy perusal stand against thy sight. And this just means, give me a pat on the back, say thanks, if you see anything in my writing that's worth reading, really. For who's so dumb that cannot write to thee, when thou thyself dost give invention light? And I think dumb is a double meaning of speechless, of course, and dumb as in stupid. So who's so stupid or can't find a voice when you are providing such incredible creative inspiration for them? They've got to be really quite stupid indeed if they can't write about you. But it's a little bit strange because he said in the previous little section that you've got to be a great writer to write about you. So sort of going back on his word there, sort of changing his mind, saying, well, you've got to be an idiot if they can't write about you. So contradicting himself. Probably needed to go back on that one, proofread it. Be thou the 10th muse, 10 times more in worth than those old 9 which rhymers advocate. Now here I think he's harping back to ancient Greece, of course. Because back in ancient Greece, the writers, all those writers in ancient Greece, they talked about the 9 muses, which were, obviously their inspiration for writing. And here Shakespeare's saying, well, actually you are the 10th muse, and you're actually way better than those other 9, those old 9 that all them Greek writers were chatting about back in the day. You're better than them. Which is saying something, because those Greek writers were pretty good, I think. And he that calls on thee, let him bring forth eternal numbers to outlive long date. So whoever calls on you for inspiration, let them write eternal verses that will live forever. That's nice, isn't it? Let them write poetry and verses that will last forever. And so far he's done pretty well, because Shakespeare has used this person as his inspiration, and it's lasted, over 450 years. So going strong. Obviously I can't say it'll last forever, because who can say? But he's done all right. And now for the final couplet, ladies and gentlemen. If my slight muse do please these curious days, the pain be mine, but thine shall be the praise. So if my small bit of inspiration pleases today's reader, then the painful part, the writing, let that be mine, but the praise shall be yours. But here is where he's wrong, because no one knows the name of the Muse, do they? Can you tell me the name? But everyone knows William Shakespeare's name. So really, the pain was Shakespeare's, and also all the praise was. So he's won there, but I'm sure at the time he made the Muse feel good about himself. So that's Sonnet 38. And look, I have to say, I don't think that's my favourite one. I think it's quite similar to some of his previous poems, and I think it's a bit of stocking filler. I think, he was maybe paid a little bit of money to do this one, boshed it out in a day maybe, and went on to the next sonnet, and hopefully a better one in Sonnet 39, because this isn't his greatest work. And I think it's important that we can criticise Shakespeare. And you know what? It's important that we have differences. So if you loved this Sonnet 38, I don't agree with you, but each to their own. And although, if Sonnet 38 is your favourite sonnet, something's up, isn't it? So here's the thing. If Sonnet 38 is your favourite sonnet, drop me a message and tell me why you like it so much. And maybe I'll consider your response. Maybe. Right, I think it's about time we put Sonnet 38 to our story. And if you're joining the podcast for the first time, what I like to do is just make up a little story surrounding the sonnets. Now, these story improvisations aren't necessarily based on real life, but I do like to think that probably these things did happen to Shakespeare, in which case he lived a hell of a life. So here's where we are in the story at the moment. Shakespeare is currently locked in jail for accidentally killing a waiter in a restaurant. And his cat, Percutio, has sought him out, and he's delivered Sonnet 37 to his current lover, John Donne. And John Donne is in the pub, obviously, having a drink, and he's just had a read of Sonnet 37. And that's where we've left off. So Shakespeare's still in jail, and John Donne needs to make a decision. Does he still want to write back to Shakespeare? Does he still love him? Or does he just want to leave him to fester? Let's find out. John Donne finished reading Shakespeare's Sonnet 37. He put down his pint, crumpled up the piece of paper, and threw it on the ground in front of the waiting Percutio. Percutio looked up at him, expecting him to write something back. But John Donne spat in Percutio's face and said, "I'm John Donne with this." That's so bad. Sorry. And said, "I'm John Donne with this. I've had enough. I want out. Don't ever contact me again." And Percutio looked up at him as if to say, "I can't write, mate. It's not my problem. I'm not Shakespeare. How do you want me to tell him this? I can't speak either. So, do you want to write something to say you don't want to see him again, or should we just leave it here?" And John Donne, as if reading his mind, said, "I can't be bothered to write something back, so hopefully he just gets the idea that I'm not coming and I'm not going to see him again." Percutio, tired and hungry at this point, thought, well, I guess that means I don't need to deliver another message, and sloped off into the night, leaving John Donne to drink another pint of bitter. Meanwhile, Shakespeare sat alone in his jail cell, thinking, "Oh, I can't wait for John Donne to come and save me. He'll break me out of prison, or he'll pay off the guards or something like that. I don't know how prison works. And we'll live happily ever after." That thought was the only thing that got him through the countless days and nights that he spent in that prison cell. He tried to write a play that he'd thought about called Taming of the Shrew, but obviously he could only use his blood as ink, and he got very faint after the first 2 pages, so he gave up. A week went by, and just as Shakespeare was giving up on life, Mercutio arrived at the window. Shakespeare jumped up and did a little jig in celebration. He thought, finally my saviour has written back to me telling me the plan to get me out. Around Mercutio's neck there was indeed a letter. Shakespeare, of course, assuming the letter was from John Donne, ripped it off from around Mercutio's neck and read. It said, "Meet me by the jail window tonight at 9 p.m. Don't be late." And Shakespeare thought, well, I can't be late because I'm literally stuck in this prison, so there's no way that I could miss this time. William Shakespeare patted Mercutio on the head and sent him on his way. 9 p.m. came about, and a hooded figure arrived just outside Shakespeare's jail window. And Shakespeare said, "Oh, John, thank God you're here to save me. I can't thank you enough." And the hooded figure pulled down their hood to reveal Shakespeare's ex-wife. Shakespeare, taken aback, went, "What are you doing here?" And she said, "Hello, William. I read about you in the newspaper." And Shakespeare said, But why would you come? You hate me. I was horrible to you." And Shakespeare's wife said, "I'm willing to give you another chance and get you out of here, if, of course, you still love me." And Shakespeare said, well, yeah, of course I can still, definitely, yes, still, of course I still love you, obviously." And Shakespeare's ex-wife said, "Well, prove it then." And Shakespeare said, "Well, how do I prove it to you? I love you. Isn't that good enough for you?" And she said, "Write me a sonnet, you know, like you did for your lovers." Shakespeare was taken aback and thought, "But I can only write sonnets for the people I really love, and I'm not really sure that I love my ex-wife anymore. But on the other hand, he'd be stuck in jail for the rest of his life if he didn't write this sonnet." And Shakespeare's wife said, "And you must say how absolutely incredible I am, and how much of an inspiration I am to you." Shakespeare said, "Yes, of course, I'll write all of that." He swiftly got out his knife and pricked his finger to get some blood as ink. Shakespeare's wife said, "What are you doing?" He said, "Well, it's the only way I can write." And she said, "Well, obviously I bought a quill for you. You don't need to cut yourself." Shakespeare said, "Thank you. That means a lot." Shakespeare's ex-wife handed over the quill and ink to Shakespeare, and he frantically started writing. Eventually, he finished. He was quite pleased with himself. He handed the note back through the bars of the window, where Shakespeare's wife was still waiting, and she said, "No, I want you to read it to me." And Shakespeare, in a quivering voice, said, Okay, here goes." And he read Sonnet 38. "How could I not have things to write about when you're here? Having you knocking about gives me sweet inspiration. You are too excellent a subject for ordinary old writers. Oh, give yourself a pat on the back if you see anything in my writing that you think is worth reading. For who is so dumb that he can't write about you when you provide the creative inspiration? You should be the 10th muse, worth 10 times more than those old 9 that poets harp on about. Whoever calls on you for illumination, let them write eternal verses to live forever. If my small bit of inspiration happens to please today's readers, the pain in writing it can be mine, but the praise shall be all yours. Well, 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 we have a return of Shakespeare's ex-wife. I think during the story I called her his wife and ex-wife, sort of intermittently. But of course this is all improvised, so I can't really go back and re-record that. But you get the bloody idea, don't you? I can't wait to move on from Sonnet 38 and find out what 39 has in store, and also how Shakespeare's wife, ex-wife, received the sonnet that he's just written for her. Did she like it? Will she help break him out of jail? Find out next week. Bye!